Hypernormalisation by A.D.M. Collingwood. In his 2016 documentary film Hypernormalisation, Adam Curtis explains that by the 1980s, Soviet leaders had realised that their vision for a socialist society had failed. They could not predict accurately and could not micromanage everything. However, they were so involved in the system they had built that they could not think of any alternatives. So, instead, they pretended that things were getting better as they travelled along the road to a socialist utopia. Alexei Yershak, the Leningrad-born professor of anthropology at Berkeley, explained what it was like to live through the period in his book Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, The Last Soviet Generation. He wrote that the citizenry knew their leaders were lying, however, the people were themselves trapped in the system and were therefore unable to imagine anything better. So they pretended to believe the pretending politicians. Society became fake, and Yershak called this pretense hypernormalisation. In Britain today, we also know that something isn't right with everything. This feeling was probably sparked in the mid-2000s when it became clear that our leaders had dragged the country into a bloody war in Iraq on a lie. Shortly after, the global financial system collapsed. Nation-states saved the world economy from collapse by pumping vast sums of money into the banking system to repair their ruined balance sheets. Nobody went to jail for this potentially world-shattering catastrophe, just as nobody was punished for Iraq. And those reforms that were undertaken trimmed around the edges, rather than questioning the assumptions upon which the systems were built. And then George Osborne and David Cameron imposed austerity on Britain, which they said was necessary to maintain the confidence of markets. Nobody in power bothered to ask whether we should still have confidence in the markets, a question every man and woman on the street was asking. It was as though, faced with two calamitous events that made it obvious that their understanding of reality was wrong, the politicians, the media, the civil service, the financiers, and the think tanks simply ignored them and continued, like the Soviet leaders, as though everything was fine. Now we see such events everywhere and all the time. Nobody, left or right, thinks the government got its response to the pandemic right. It was clear that they were bumbling and bluffing the whole way. The migrant crisis on the south coast continues, even as the head of Border Force says he hates borders. Grooming gangs, which rape and press into sexual slavery our most vulnerable daughters, remain at large in our cities. Drug taking has reached epidemic levels, with the relatively tiny number of prosecutions making little difference. Knife crime and gang culture menaces the law-abiding and wastes the potential of countless young men from poor backgrounds. Homelessness can be seen everywhere, and our country has recently been rocked by 2 child murders. Our leaders seem not only powerless to deal with any of this, but oblivious to it all. Yet, these are mere events. What most of us realise is that our whole structure of national management is broken. Our standard of living is only maintained by the acceptance of ever greater levels of debt, both state and personal. Even then, young middle-class people find themselves unable to afford to buy a home. As prices rise, it dawns on them that they are unlikely to ever be able to afford one. The working class shouldn't even bother dreaming. Our industry, which once provided decent, productive jobs, has disappeared. So much so that we cannot even manufacture PPE or glass vials for vaccines anymore. The British concept of fairness has been replaced, in law, with the alien notion of equality, which itself moves toward equity, and has manifestly unfair, strange, and damaging effects throughout society and its organisation. Our education and training system is failing to the extent that universities must be forced to accept state school leavers for undergraduate degrees, and that we are reliant on foreigners to do basic skilled jobs like plumbing, building, HGV driving, and even waiting tables. Children are considerably more likely to have a TV in their bedrooms than a father in the house. Half of marriages end in divorce, and yet we know that being raised by two parents is a key metric for childhood and thence adult outcomes. Meanwhile, 50 years ago, being wealthy meant a bigger house, a fancier car, and a holiday to a more distant destination. Now it means living in a completely different world, detached from the existence of the rest of us. The response of our political parties has been hypernormal. The mainstream left has made a weird and unholy alliance with big business and the holders of capital. First, to encourage the type of individualism and self-expression, i.e. diversity, that precludes the class solidarity needed for change. Secondly, to encourage the importation of cheap migrant labour to hold down wages, and thirdly, to encourage Californian tech oligarchs to take increasing control over our political discourse. The mainstream right's response has been equally hypernormal. Their argument for leaving the deepest and most successful free trade bloc in the world seems to have been that it would allow us to do more free trade. It has no concept that people voted for Brexit because of the excesses of free trade and free movement of capital. It wails about the effects of diversity, and yet it shows no sign, with an 80-seat majority, of taking the Blair-era Human Rights Act and Equality Act that make reform in this direction nearly impossible. It talks about family values, but further weakens marriage through legislation. It offers fighting talk on open borders, yet it takes none of the steps needed to stem the flow on the south coast. Both main parties are just moving ahead as normal. No matter what they say, their actions are in fact those of people who believe the system should continue as it is, and we the people are so caught up in the system that despite seeing with our own eyes that something is wrong everywhere, we keep voting for the same outcome. We fear what might happen if we don't. The other side will get in, and lack the imagination to see an alternative. But to paraphrase Alexei Yershak, hypernormalisation is forever, until it is no more. Thank you for listening to this Bournbrook essay. You can read our print issues and online articles at bournbrookmag.com, and you can support Bournbrook at bournbrookmag.com/subscribe.